The cruelest mistake people make is believing that wisdom has an expiration date. On the first Monday morning of September, the campus of Harrison State University buzzed with the nervous excitement that always came with a new semester. Freshly painted brick walkways shimmered beneath the early sunlight, backpacks swung over young shoulders, and conversations bounced through the crisp autumn air like echoes of futures waiting to be written. Among hundreds of 18-year-olds laughing, taking selfies, and searching for lecture halls, one woman walked with measured steps that seemed to carry the weight of an entirely different lifetime. Danielle Brooks was 42 years old, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and impossible to ignore. Her dark skin glowed beneath the gentle morning light. Her neatly pressed navy blouse contrasted with a simple cardigan she had owned for years, and her worn leather tote carried secondhand textbooks instead of expensive electronics. She wasn't embarrassed by any of it. She had simply learned long ago that survival left little room for vanity. Yet survival had never erased her dream. 23 years earlier, she had walked away from college after a single semester because real life had demanded more than classrooms ever could. Medical bills, family responsibilities, endless overtime shifts, and sacrifices too numerous to count had quietly replaced lectures and exams. While others built careers, Danielle built stability for everyone except herself. But dreams, unlike calendars, refused to recognize age. This morning, she had finally returned to claim the education she had postponed for more than 2 decades. She stopped for a brief moment beneath the university's stone entrance sign and drew a slow breath. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear of learning, but from wondering whether this place would ever see her as someone who belonged. Before she could take another step, a burst of laughter drifted across the courtyard. A group of students standing beside the student center glanced toward her. One young man lowered his sunglasses and smirked. Another quietly lifted his phone. Within seconds, the camera pointed directly at Danielle. "Yo, check this out." He laughed loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Somebody's mom got lost on move-in day. The others erupted into laughter. One young woman covered her mouth, while another whispered something that made the entire group grin even wider. The phone continued recording as captions were already being imagined before the video would ever be uploaded. Danielle heard every word. She noticed every stare. She felt every smile that wasn't offered with kindness. For just an instant, old memories threatened to return, reminding her of every door that had once closed because people decided what she was worth before she ever spoke. But instead of lowering her head, she adjusted the strap of her tote, straightened her shoulders, and kept walking with quiet dignity. She had survived far worse than strangers who mistook confidence for something laughable. Across the courtyard, seated alone on a wooden bench beneath an oak tree, another student watched the entire exchange unfold without saying a single word. Ethan Park appeared no older than 32, dressed in a charcoal jacket, dark jeans, and polished brown shoes that looked understated only to people who didn't recognize exceptional craftsmanship. His posture remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable, and his calm eyes followed Danielle instead of the crowd surrounding her. Unlike everyone else, he never reached for his phone. He never smiled. He simply observed. There was something unusual about the woman crossing the courtyard. Most people reacted to ridicule by shrinking into themselves. Danielle seemed to grow steadier with every mocking voice behind her. Ethan noticed the tiny details others completely missed. The careful organization of her books, the notes already tucked between the pages, the determination hidden behind tired eyes that had clearly seen far more of life than any freshman orientation could teach. The laughter around him grew louder as another student announced that the video was already gaining views. Danielle climbed the wide stone steps toward the business school without looking back once. The heavy wooden doors opened, swallowing her into a building filled with unfamiliar hallways and unknown possibilities. Ethan remained seated for another silent moment before finally standing and brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. His eyes lingered on the doorway she had disappeared through. The students believed they had just captured the funniest moment of their morning. None of them realized they had also witnessed the beginning of a story that would challenge every assumption they carried about intelligence, success, and the true meaning of strength. Sometimes the loudest people in the room only reveal how little they actually understand. And sometimes the quietest person walking through the door is the one destined to rewrite everyone else's definition of brilliance. Danielle Brooks arrived outside room 214 nearly 20 minutes before class began. The hallway was still quiet, filled only with the distant echo of lockers closing and professors greeting one another with the familiar rhythm of another academic year. She carefully removed a small notebook from her tote and reviewed the handwritten schedule she had copied the night before. Every class, every assignment deadline, every office hour had been highlighted in different colors because she had learned through decades of balancing impossible responsibilities that preparation often mattered more than talent. While many students depended on digital calendars, Danielle trusted the pages she could touch. They reminded her that every goal became real only after someone took the time to write it down. As she stood outside the classroom, her fingers briefly brushed the silver bracelet around her wrist. It had belonged to her mother, who used to tell her that education was something nobody could take away once it truly belonged to you. Danielle smiled softly at the memory before slipping into the lecture hall. Rows of polished desks stretched toward a large projection screen, and sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the campus lawn. Students quickly filled the seats closest to one another, laughing about dorm life, football games, and weekend plans. Danielle quietly selected a seat near the center of the room, believing learning happened best where distractions were few. The conversations around her slowed for only a moment before whispers replaced laughter. Some glanced at her and then quickly looked away. Others were less subtle. A young woman leaned toward her friend and whispered, "She looks older than Professor Harris." Another quietly replied, "Maybe she is the teaching assistant." The jokes continued just softly enough that no one would openly admit making them. Danielle opened her notebook without reacting. She had spent years cleaning office buildings after midnight while executives discussed million-dollar contracts, as though she were invisible. She had worked grocery store shifts where customers avoided eye contact. She had spent countless evenings serving meals at retirement homes where lonely strangers shared stories simply because she was willing to listen. Those experiences had taught her something far more valuable than resentment. People often revealed their own insecurities long before they revealed yours. Professor Alan Harris entered exactly at 9 o'clock, carrying a stack of folders beneath one arm. His silver hair, calm voice, and warm smile immediately quieted the room. After introducing the course, he surprised everyone by announcing that the semester would revolve around real-world strategic problem-solving rather than memorizing textbooks. Success, he explained, belonged to people who could recognize patterns others overlooked. The statement caught Danielle's attention immediately. She had spent more than 20 years solving problems that never appeared in any classroom, stretching one paycheck across an entire month, negotiating medical bills, organizing work schedules around family emergencies, learning which conversations required patience and which demanded courage. None of those lessons appeared on a transcript, yet each one had quietly sharpened her mind. Professor Harris continued speaking before introducing an unexpected visitor sitting near the back of the classroom. "This semester," he announced, "our business innovation program is receiving support from a private educational foundation. One of its representatives has chosen to observe several classes personally." Every head turned toward the back of the room. Danielle looked too, and her breath caught slightly as she recognized the sharp charcoal jacket and the calm, observing eyes of the man who had sat silently on the wooden bench beneath the oak tree earlier that week. He was not a student at all. Ethan Park rose politely, offering only a brief nod before introducing himself in a calm, measured voice. He described himself simply as an entrepreneur interested in identifying unconventional talent. Nothing about his appearance suggested arrogance. Nothing about his words invited unnecessary attention. Yet there was an unmistakable confidence that settled over the room whenever he spoke. Danielle listened without forming any assumptions. She had learned long ago that the loudest credentials rarely belonged to the wisest people. Ethan's eyes briefly swept across the classroom before resting for less than a second on Danielle. It was not curiosity. It was recognition. He had noticed the only student who was listening to understand rather than listening to impress. Professor Harris then distributed the first assignment of the semester. Instead of individual work, everyone would complete a semester-long strategic case study in randomly assigned teams. Groans immediately spread through the classroom as students realized they could not choose their friends. Professor Harris smiled knowingly before opening a sealed envelope containing the team assignments. Danielle folded her hands together and quietly waited. She had no idea that within the next few minutes, a single decision made inside that classroom would place her directly across the table from the one man who had watched her walk through ridicule without surrendering a single ounce of dignity. Professor Harris adjusted his glasses, unfolded the assignment sheet, and began reading the team roster one name at a time. Around the room, students relaxed whenever they heard the names of familiar friends grouped together, while others sighed in disappointment when luck failed them. Danielle Brooks simply listened without expectation. She had spent enough years in the real world to know that success rarely depended on choosing comfortable partners. Sometimes the people who challenged you the most became the reason you discovered abilities you never knew you possessed. Team 7, Professor Harris announced. Danielle Brooks, Ethan Park, Olivia Bennett, Mason Reed. An uneasy silence drifted across the classroom before someone in the back quietly laughed. Another student whispered loudly enough for several others to hear. That team is already finished. Olivia glanced toward Danielle before forcing an awkward smile that disappeared almost immediately. Mason leaned back in his chair and muttered, "There goes our grade." Danielle pretended not to hear. Instead, she carefully wrote the names into her notebook with the same neat handwriting she used for everything else. Ethan remained expressionless, neither pleased nor disappointed. He simply closed his notebook and walked toward the discussion tables at the front of the classroom, where each team had been instructed to meet. Olivia and Mason followed with obvious hesitation. Danielle arrived last, placing her worn notebook beside 3 sleek laptops and expensive tablets that immediately made her supplies appear decades behind. Mason looked at her paper notebook before exchanging a glance with Olivia. "Do you even use cloud storage?" he asked with a faint grin. Danielle smiled politely. "I believe good ideas survive whether they are written on paper or stored online." Olivia forced a nervous laugh while Mason shrugged as though the answer confirmed every assumption he had already made. Professor Harris projected the semester's opening challenge onto the large screen. Every team would receive the same fictional business case involving a struggling neighborhood grocery chain that had lost customers for 5 consecutive years despite significant investments in advertising, renovations, and technology. The assignment sounded straightforward until the professor added one final instruction. Do not solve the problem by recommending more money, more marketing, or more technology. Assume those resources already exist. Find the mistake everyone else keeps missing. A ripple of confusion swept through the room. Mason immediately opened several business databases while Olivia searched recent retail trends. Danielle quietly read every page of the case study without speaking. Ethan did not open his computer at all. Instead, he watched each member of the team approach the problem in completely different ways. 15 minutes passed before Mason finally looked up with confidence. "The answer is obvious," he declared. "The company needs younger branding and social media influencers." Olivia nodded quickly. "Or maybe a loyalty rewards application with artificial intelligence recommendations." They both turned toward Ethan, expecting approval. He simply asked one question. "Did either of you explain why customers stopped trusting the stores before discussing how to attract them back?" The table fell silent. Mason frowned and searched through the documents again. Olivia scrolled faster across her screen. Neither found an answer. Danielle slowly turned another page before speaking for the first time. Her voice was calm, steady, and almost conversational. The problem did not begin when customers stopped shopping there. It began much earlier. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Danielle pointed to a single paragraph buried near the end of the packet. Employee turnover increased by nearly 70% over 4 years. Customer complaints rose immediately afterward. Every marketing campaign happened after experienced workers had already left. The company believed advertising could replace relationships. Customers were never buying groceries alone. They were returning because they trusted the people behind the checkout counters. Mason blinked. Olivia lowered her laptop screen. Ethan's expression remained controlled, but something subtle shifted behind his eyes. Danielle continued without realizing everyone at the table had stopped taking notes. When people feel known, they come back. When they feel processed, they leave. Technology can improve convenience, It cannot replace genuine trust. Ethan quietly reached for the packet and reread the paragraph she had referenced. Buried in a footnote was a statistic every other team had ignored because it appeared too ordinary to matter. Yet Danielle had recognized it immediately, not because of business school, but because she had spent years working in places where customers returned for familiar smiles rather than lower prices. Across the classroom, other groups debated complicated financial models and digital strategies, while Team 7 sat in complete silence. It was not the uncomfortable silence of strangers. It was the silence that appears when certainty quietly gives way to respect. Ethan closed the folder and looked directly at Danielle for the first time since they had been assigned together. "Interesting observation," he said softly. Danielle simply nodded and returned to her notebook, unaware that the first move in a much larger game had already been made, and that the one person who understood exactly how unusual her answer truly was had just decided to pay much closer attention. The following week settled into a steady rhythm that surprised nearly everyone except Danielle. While most students rushed through assignments between social events and late-night study sessions, she approached every class with the quiet discipline of someone who had waited 23 years for the opportunity sitting in front of her. She arrived early every morning with handwritten notes prepared long before the lecture began, listened more than she spoke, and asked questions that seemed almost too simple until they exposed problems no one else had noticed. Professor Harris began introducing increasingly difficult case studies, each designed to challenge assumptions rather than reward memorization. During one session, every team received a report describing a manufacturing company suffering declining productivity despite generous salaries and modern equipment. Mason immediately blamed inefficient software. Olivia suggested reorganizing management. Several teams reached similar conclusions, filling whiteboards with complicated charts and technical solutions. Danielle quietly read the employee interview transcripts attached to the final pages of the report. After several silent minutes, she looked up. "Everyone is trying to repair the machines," she said softly. "Nobody is asking why experienced employees stopped caring enough to use them well." Mason frowned. "That is not in the financial data." Danielle gently tapped a paragraph near the bottom of the report. "It is here. Exit interviews mention that supervisors stopped recognizing individual contributions after production targets increased. People stopped feeling seen before they stopped performing." Professor Harris, who had been walking between tables, paused when he heard her observation. Without interrupting, he simply continued listening. Danielle explained that productivity often reflected trust more than efficiency. She spoke about appreciation, consistency, and leadership with a confidence that did not sound academic. It sounded lived. Ethan remained silent, studying not only her conclusions, but also the process she used to reach them. She never chased the biggest numbers first. She searched for the smallest overlooked details because she believed important truths usually hid where few people bothered to look. That afternoon, after class ended, Team 7 gathered in the library to organize research for their semester project. Olivia noticed something unusual. Danielle never searched for answers immediately. Instead, she filled several notebook pages with questions. "Why do you always start with questions instead of solutions?" Olivia asked. Danielle smiled warmly. "Because a good answer to the wrong question is still the wrong answer." Ethan looked up from his laptop. It was the exact sentence she had spoken during their first discussion, but now he realized it was not simply a clever phrase. It was the foundation of how she thought. As the afternoon continued, Mason presented a lengthy market analysis supported by colorful graphs and industry forecasts. It looked impressive until Danielle quietly pointed toward a single customer survey hidden inside the appendix. "These numbers only measure people who still shop there," she observed. "The customers who already left were never asked why they stopped coming." Mason stared at the page before slowly lowering his tablet. Once again, she had discovered the missing piece everyone else had overlooked. Ethan noticed something even more remarkable. Danielle never corrected anyone to embarrass them. She never raised her voice. She never celebrated being right. Every observation she offered invited the rest of the team to think more deeply rather than making them feel smaller. Respect seemed to follow her naturally because she gave it first. Across campus, however, the video recorded during Danielle's first day continued spreading across student social media. New comments appeared almost daily. Some questioned whether she belonged in college at her age. Others joked about her appearance without ever meeting her. Danielle never saw most of those messages because she rarely spent time online, but Ethan quietly did. One evening, while reviewing student discussions connected to the university, he recognized the same clip that had begun circulating during orientation week. Thousands of views, hundreds of careless comments, dozens of strangers deciding who Danielle was based on less than 30 seconds of video. Ethan watched the recording only once before closing the screen without expression. He had spent years watching people make expensive mistakes because they judged situations too quickly. This one felt strangely familiar. The next morning, Professor Harris announced an unexpected development. Representatives from the Educational Foundation would personally evaluate selected student teams during the following month. Their work would no longer remain inside the classroom. Every conversation, every recommendation, and every decision would be observed under professional standards. Excitement filled the room as students immediately began discussing scholarships, internships, and networking opportunities. Danielle quietly wrote the date into her notebook. Ethan watched her for a brief moment before looking toward the classroom windows where the autumn sunlight stretched across the campus. Somewhere beyond those walls, people still believed they already understood Danielle Brooks. They had no idea that the questions she kept asking were slowly leading everyone toward answers capable of changing far more than a single class project. By the middle of October, the campus had transformed beneath shades of gold and crimson, and so had the atmosphere inside Professor Harris's classroom. The assignments had become noticeably more demanding, no longer rewarding textbook knowledge alone, but forcing every student to defend each conclusion with observation, evidence, and judgment. Team 7 had quietly become one of the strongest groups in the course, although few students outside the classroom understood why. Most assumed Ethan Park carried the team. Others believed Olivia and Mason had simply improved. Almost no one imagined that the woman they had laughed at during the first week had become the quiet center, holding everything together. One Tuesday morning, Professor Harris entered carrying only a single black folder. He placed it on the podium without saying a word, allowing curiosity to settle over the room before finally speaking. The Educational Foundation has requested a special evaluation. Every team will receive a confidential case study that has never been used in any university competition. There is no correct answer. We are evaluating how you think, not what you know. The room immediately fell silent. Professor Harris continued. Each team will have 90 minutes. You may use your notes, but you may not use the internet. Every assumption must be supported by reasoning. As sealed envelopes were distributed across the classroom, Ethan quietly studied Professor Harris rather than the assignment. Something about the professor's unusually formal tone suggested this evaluation carried greater significance than anyone realized. Danielle carefully opened the envelope and began reading. The scenario described a rapidly growing international logistics company that had expanded into several major cities before unexpectedly losing the confidence of both employees and long-term business partners. Financial reports remained healthy. Customer satisfaction appeared stable. Public perception remained positive. Yet confidential internal reports revealed an alarming pattern of experienced executives resigning without explanation. Mason immediately began outlining financial risk models. Olivia focused on public relations strategies. Danielle read every page twice before setting the packet aside. Ethan noticed she had not written a single note. Instead, she quietly closed her eyes for several seconds as though replaying the entire document in her mind. Finally, she spoke. Something important is missing. Mason looked confused. Everything we need is in the packet. Danielle slowly shook her head. No, everything they want us to notice is in the packet. The missing information is what matters. Ethan leaned forward with genuine interest. Explain. Danielle picked up the executive resignation summaries. Every departing executive uses almost identical language. Different names, different offices, same emotional tone. People rarely describe personal experiences using nearly identical words unless someone helps write the statements. Olivia frowned. You think the resignations were coordinated? Danielle nodded thoughtfully. Not coordinated. Managed. She turned another page. Look here. Every executive resigned within 48 hours after attending the same leadership conference. Yet there is no transcript, no agenda, and no participant feedback included anywhere in the report. Whoever prepared this case removed the conversation that actually changed everything. Ethan remained perfectly still. It was the first time anyone had challenged the structure of the case itself instead of attempting to solve the problem presented inside it. Danielle continued calmly. If the evidence feels unusually clean, someone cleaned it. Real organizations are messy. Real people contradict themselves. This file has too much agreement and not enough humanity. Across the classroom, other teams filled whiteboards with complex organizational charts and colorful diagrams. Team 7 sat in thoughtful silence. Ethan looked directly at Danielle, no longer evaluating whether she was intelligent, but trying to understand how her mind consistently reached places conventional analysis never touched. Professor Harris slowly walked between the tables, quietly observing every discussion. When he reached Team 7, he noticed Danielle had drawn only one sentence across the top of her notebook. Never trust a conclusion that arrives before the right question. The professor paused for a brief moment before continuing his rounds without comment. He recognized the sentence immediately because it echoed a principle rarely taught outside advanced leadership programs. 40 minutes later, each team presented preliminary conclusions. Most recommended restructuring departments, increasing communication, or replacing executives. When Team 7's turn arrived, Mason unexpectedly stepped aside. Danielle should present, he said quietly. She looked surprised but accepted with her usual calm confidence. Standing before the classroom, she did not begin with recommendations. Instead, she asked a single question. Who wrote the information we were told to trust? The room became completely still. Even students who had spent weeks dismissing her looked up from their laptops. Danielle explained that every decision made from incomplete assumptions would eventually produce incomplete solutions. Before fixing any organization, leaders had to determine whether the story they received reflected reality or merely reflected someone's preferred version of reality. Ethan watched the classroom more than Danielle herself. One by one, expressions changed. Confusion became curiosity. Curiosity became respect. For the first time since the semester had begun, the room was no longer seeing Danielle Brooks as the oldest student in class. They were beginning to see something far more difficult to measure. And somewhere behind his calm expression, Ethan quietly realized that the greatest challenge he had expected to find inside this university was no longer the competition. It was the extraordinary woman standing only a few feet away. The following Friday afternoon, Professor Harris entered the classroom with an expression that immediately silenced every conversation. Without opening his notes, he looked slowly across the room before speaking. The Foundation representatives have requested one final exercise before selecting scholarship finalists. This is not an examination. It is a leadership simulation. Every team will send one representative. Curious whispers filled the room as assistants rolled several portable display screens to the front. Each screen displayed identical information describing a fictional corporation facing an unexpected crisis. A key supplier had suddenly withdrawn from a major contract. Employees were uncertain about the future, investors demanded immediate answers, and community leaders worried about the economic impact on hundreds of local families. The challenge was simple to explain, but far more difficult to solve. Each participant would have 20 minutes to recommend a complete response while answering questions from a review panel. Mason quietly leaned toward Danielle. You should do it. She looked surprised. You have presented before. Mason smiled with genuine honesty. I know numbers. You understand people. Olivia immediately nodded in agreement. Ethan said nothing for several seconds before adding, I agree. It was the first time all semester that every member of Team 7 reached the same conclusion without debate. Danielle accepted with quiet humility and walked toward the presentation area, carrying nothing except her notebook. Other representatives arrived with detailed slides, printed charts, and carefully rehearsed speeches. Danielle placed her notebook on the podium but never opened it. The moderator welcomed the participants before explaining that the review panel could interrupt at any moment with unexpected questions. Several students appeared visibly nervous. Danielle simply folded her hands together and listened carefully to every instruction before beginning. One by one, participants presented ambitious recovery plans. Some recommended aggressive expansion. Others suggested restructuring departments or replacing leadership teams. Every proposal sounded polished and technically impressive. Yet each one treated the crisis as though it were merely a financial equation waiting to be solved. When Danielle's turn arrived, the room settled into complete silence. She looked briefly at the case summary before lifting her eyes toward the panel. Before discussing solutions, she began calmly. I would like to understand one decision. One evaluator leaned forward. Which decision? Danielle smiled gently. Who decided that this situation should be described as a supply crisis? The evaluator paused. The supplier withdrew. Danielle nodded. That is an event. It is not necessarily the problem. Several professors exchanged curious glances. Danielle continued. If employees immediately fear the future after losing one supplier, trust inside the organization was already fragile. Healthy organizations experience setbacks without losing confidence. This company did not lose stability because one contract disappeared. It lost stability because people never believed leadership would protect them when difficulties arrived. A thoughtful silence settled across the room. Danielle walked slowly toward the display screen without raising her voice. Every recommendation I have heard today begins with restoring revenue. I would begin by restoring credibility. Meet employees before investors. Meet community leaders before reporters. Tell the truth before making promises. Trust grows through consistency, not announcements. One evaluator challenged her politely. Would that satisfy shareholders? Danielle answered without hesitation. Shareholders invest in organizations they believe will survive tomorrow. Employees determine whether tomorrow exists. Ethan watched every exchange with extraordinary focus. The questions became more difficult, yet Danielle never rushed an answer. She listened completely before responding, often asking another question that quietly changed the direction of the discussion itself. She never argued. She never attempted to impress anyone. She simply illuminated possibilities others had failed to consider. Finally, one senior evaluator smiled and asked, Ms. Brooks, where did you study organizational leadership? Danielle hesitated for only a moment. Mostly at grocery stores, hospitals, restaurants, and office buildings. She answered with gentle sincerity. People explain more about leadership during ordinary workdays than they sometimes realize. Soft laughter spread across the room, followed by something much rarer. Respect. As Danielle returned to her seat, Professor Harris quietly closed his folder without making a single note. Ethan remained perfectly still, but inside his carefully disciplined mind another assumption had quietly fallen away. He had entered the semester believing exceptional thinkers could be identified through credentials, prestigious schools, and carefully measured achievements. Danielle Brooks was dismantling that belief one conversation at a time. Watching her was beginning to feel less like observing a student and more like discovering a truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The leadership simulation became the defining conversation across Harrison State University for the rest of the week. Professors discussed it in faculty meetings. Students debated it in coffee shops and study lounges. Many who had barely noticed Danielle during the first month of classes suddenly found themselves repeating her observations almost word for word, often forgetting where those ideas had originated. Danielle herself remained completely unchanged. She still arrived before sunrise, still carried the same worn leather tote, and still spent the hour before class reviewing handwritten notes beneath the old oak tree near the business building. To her, recognition was pleasant but temporary. Learning was the real reward. One quiet morning, as golden leaves drifted across the nearly empty courtyard, Ethan approached the bench where Danielle was organizing index cards filled with questions instead of answers. He stood a respectful distance away before speaking. May I join you? Danielle looked up with a warm smile. Of course. Ethan sat beside her without saying anything for several moments. The campus remained unusually peaceful, interrupted only by distant footsteps and the soft rustling of autumn branches. Finally, he asked the question that had occupied his thoughts for weeks. Where did you learn to think like this? Danielle laughed gently, not because the question amused her, but because she had never considered her way of thinking unusual. Life has a patient way of teaching anyone who is willing to pay attention. Ethan nodded slowly. That is not the whole answer. Danielle looked down at the bracelet around her wrist before drawing a quiet breath. No, she admitted. It is not. For the first time since they had met, she allowed someone to see the chapters of her life she rarely discussed. At 19, she had entered college with a full academic scholarship and dreams of becoming a criminal justice researcher. She had loved behavioral psychology, negotiation theory, ethics, and decision science. She was fascinated by one simple question. Why did good people sometimes make poor decisions, while ordinary people occasionally demonstrated extraordinary wisdom? Her professors believed she would continue into graduate school. Then everything changed within a single year. Her mother became seriously ill. Her younger brother and sister still depended on her. Tuition became impossible to justify when rent, medicine, groceries, and family responsibilities demanded every available dollar. Danielle quietly withdrew from school without attending a farewell ceremony. "Did you ever regret leaving?" Ethan asked. Danielle answered without hesitation. "Every single day." The honesty in her voice carried no bitterness, only quiet acceptance. "But regret is different from resentment. I chose my family. I would make the same choice again." Ethan listened without interrupting. Danielle continued. "The strange thing is that I never really stopped studying." She smiled softly as though remembering hundreds of forgotten evenings. "Libraries are free. Used bookstores are inexpensive. Public lectures cost nothing. During lunch breaks, I read. On buses, I read. Before work, after work, weekends, holidays. Sometimes only 15 minutes at a time. But 15 minutes becomes years if you never quit." Ethan remained silent. Danielle's words explained everything he had been struggling to understand. She had not suddenly become insightful after returning to college. She had been quietly educating herself for more than 2 decades while the rest of the world assumed her opportunities had ended. She reached into her tote and removed an old notebook whose pages had yellowed with age. The cover showed small cracks from years of use. Inside were carefully organized notes dating back more than 20 years. Observations from books, ideas copied from lectures she had attended, newspaper articles, questions she had written but never fully answered, margins filled with reflections connecting everyday experiences to theories she had once studied as a teenager. Ethan turned several pages carefully, almost reverently. "You kept all of this?" Danielle nodded. Dreams are easier to carry when they fit inside a notebook. Neither of them noticed Professor Harris watching quietly from the second-floor window overlooking the courtyard. The professor had recognized the notebook immediately. Years earlier, Danielle had submitted one of its earliest essays before leaving school. He still remembered reading it as a young teaching assistant at another university. At the time, he had predicted she possessed one of the sharpest analytical minds he had encountered. Looking down now, he realized something remarkable. Life had interrupted Danielle's education, but it had never interrupted her curiosity. As Ethan carefully returned the notebook, he looked at Danielle with a level of respect that no longer required words. The woman sitting beside him had spent 23 years building an education without classrooms, applause, or recognition. She had transformed ordinary life into an extraordinary university, one quiet lesson at a time. And in that peaceful moment beneath the falling autumn leaves, Ethan finally understood that the greatest advantage Danielle Brooks possessed was not intelligence alone. It was the discipline to keep learning long after everyone else believed her story had already been written. By early November, the final stage of the foundation evaluation had arrived. The atmosphere across the business school felt noticeably different. Students no longer viewed the competition as another classroom exercise. Scholarships, prestigious internships, and invitations to exclusive leadership programs all depended on what happened next. Professor Harris entered carrying a sealed envelope stamped with the foundation's insignia. Without unnecessary ceremony, he addressed the class. The review committee has selected 2 participants for the final strategic dialogue. This is not a debate. There will be no audience vote and no declared winner. We simply wish to observe how 2 exceptional minds approach uncertainty. Every student leaned forward. Ms. Danielle Brooks. A wave of quiet approval spread through the room. Even those who had once questioned her presence now nodded respectfully. Professor Harris continued. And Ethan Park. Ethan rose calmly while Danielle offered him a polite smile. Neither appeared surprised. The dialogue would take place in the university's historic conference room, a space normally reserved for visiting executives and distinguished alumni. Tall windows overlooked the crimson trees lining the central quad, Polished walnut tables reflected the afternoon light, and portraits of past university presidents watched silently from the walls. 5 Foundation representatives sat along one side of the room, while Professor Harris quietly observed from the back. The moderator explained the exercise. You will both receive the same situation. There is no hidden trick. We are interested only in your reasoning. A folder was placed before each participant. The scenario described an expanding international organization preparing to acquire a smaller regional company. Financially, the acquisition made perfect sense. Public support was overwhelmingly positive. Legal approval appeared certain. Yet confidential interviews revealed growing resistance from long-term employees inside the smaller organization. The moderator looked toward Ethan first. Mr. Park, how would you proceed? Ethan answered with his usual precision. He emphasized transparency, careful communication, gradual operational integration, leadership visibility, and preserving the acquired company's strongest traditions. His recommendations reflected remarkable discipline and strategic balance. Several evaluators nodded with clear approval. When he finished, the moderator turned toward Danielle. Ms. Brooks. Danielle did not immediately respond. Instead, she quietly reread a single paragraph before looking up. I would not approve the acquisition. A subtle silence settled across the room. One evaluator leaned forward. Could you explain? Danielle nodded. Everyone assumes the acquisition itself is the decision. I believe that assumption is incorrect. Ethan watched her closely. She continued with complete calm. The employee interviews describe fear, uncertainty, and declining trust. Yet every concern is attributed to future organizational change. Nobody asked why trust was already weak before the acquisition was announced. Another evaluator responded. The financial data remains extremely strong. Danielle smiled gently. Healthy numbers often describe the past. Trust predicts the future. She turned one page. There is another detail. Every interview was conducted by the acquiring company's transition office. Employees rarely reveal their deepest concerns to the people responsible for evaluating them. We are making strategic decisions based upon incomplete emotional information. Ethan slowly lowered his pen. Danielle had not challenged his conclusion. She had questioned the foundation beneath it. The moderator decided to probe further. Suppose delaying the acquisition costs millions of dollars. Danielle answered without hesitation. Recovering millions is usually possible. Recovering trust after people believe they were ignored is far more expensive. The room became perfectly still. Ethan quietly reopened the file and reviewed the interview summaries again. This time he noticed something he had completely overlooked. Every employee quoted by name held a management position. Not one frontline worker had been interviewed. The case had measured leadership opinion while assuming it represented organizational reality. Danielle had recognized the missing voices before evaluating the visible evidence. Ethan looked toward her with genuine admiration. For the first time in many years, he realized he had reached a logical conclusion too quickly because the available information appeared complete. Danielle had looked beyond the pages themselves. She had asked who was absent from the conversation. The moderator finally smiled. Mr. Park, would you change your recommendation after hearing Ms. Brooks? Ethan answered slowly, choosing every word with unusual care. Yes. Several evaluators exchanged surprised glances. Ethan continued. I believed I understood the problem. Ms. Brooks demonstrated that I accepted the framework without questioning who created it. She solved a better question than the one I answered. Danielle lowered her eyes modestly, clearly uncomfortable with public praise. Ethan turned toward her directly. Thank you, he said sincerely. You reminded me that intelligence is not measured by finding answers quickly. It is measured by recognizing when the question itself is incomplete. No applause followed. None was necessary. The quiet that filled the historic conference room carried far greater weight than celebration. In that silent moment, everyone present understood they had witnessed something extraordinarily rare. 2 remarkable minds had entered the room prepared to compete. Only one had walked away, proving that genuine wisdom begins where certainty ends. The final week of the semester arrived wrapped in crisp December air, and Harrison State University seemed quieter than it had only a few months earlier. The towering oak trees had surrendered their last golden leaves. The campus lawns shimmered beneath a thin layer of morning frost, and students hurried between buildings carrying final projects instead of football jerseys. Inside the university auditorium, faculty members, students, and representatives from the Educational Foundation gathered for the closing ceremony of the leadership program. Professor Harris stood behind the podium with a warmth in his eyes that reflected far more than professional pride. One by one, awards were presented, certificates distributed, and scholarships announced. When Danielle Brooks heard her name called as the recipient of the Foundation Leadership Fellowship, the room erupted into sincere applause. She rose slowly from her seat, still carrying herself with the same quiet humility she had shown on the first day. She walked across campus with nothing more than a worn leather tote and a dream postponed for 23 years. As she accepted the award, she looked toward the audience and noticed something unexpected. Several of the students who had laughed at her during orientation stood waiting near the front after the ceremony ended. The young man who had recorded the video stepped forward first, holding his phone with noticeably different hands than he had. Months before, his confidence had disappeared, replaced by honest discomfort. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I deleted the video weeks ago, but deleting it does not erase what I did. I am sorry." Danielle looked at him for a long moment before offering the same gentle smile she had carried through every challenge that semester. "The important thing is not that you were wrong," she replied softly. "It is that you were willing to learn." The young man lowered his eyes, grateful for a kindness he knew he had not earned. Around him, several other students offered similar apologies. None of them were dramatic. None required speeches. They were simply honest acknowledgments that wisdom often arrives only after pride leaves the room. Across the auditorium, Ethan Park quietly observed the scene before walking toward Professor Harris. The professor smiled knowingly. "I imagine the foundation found exactly what it was searching for." Ethan nodded. "It found far more than that." Professor Harris looked toward Danielle, who was patiently speaking with younger students asking for advice about balancing work, family, and education. "You knew she was extraordinary before anyone else did you not?" Ethan smiled faintly. "No, I only knew she deserved to be taken seriously. The rest she proved herself." The professor folded his hands thoughtfully. "Many people spend their lives collecting credentials. Very few spend their lives collecting wisdom." Ethan remained silent for several moments before speaking with unusual honesty. "There is something I have never shared publicly." Professor Harris listened carefully. "The foundation I represent is only one part of my responsibilities. My family's business has always required evaluating people under pressure. I believed I understood how to recognize exceptional judgment. Ms. Brooks showed me that I had been measuring the wrong qualities all along." The professor nodded without surprise. Ethan walked across the auditorium until he reached Danielle. She looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn since the first morning they met beneath the autumn sun. "Congratulations," he said sincerely. Danielle laughed softly. "I think we both learned something this semester." Ethan nodded. "Yes, but I learned more." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and handed her a small cream-colored envelope bearing the foundation's seal. "This is not another scholarship," he explained. "It is an invitation. We would like you to serve as an advisor for future leadership programs after you graduate. Students need to hear from someone who understands both textbooks and life." Danielle looked at the envelope without opening it immediately. For a brief moment, her eyes glistened with quiet gratitude. Not because of the opportunity itself, but because someone finally saw value in everything life had taught her outside a classroom. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the auditorium, casting long golden reflections across the polished floor, Danielle slipped the invitation into the same worn leather tote she had carried since the first day of class. Nothing about the bag had changed. Nothing about her quiet humility had changed either. Only the way the world looked at her had changed. Students who once measured her by age now measured themselves against her example. Professors who admired her intellect now admired her perseverance even more. Ethan Park walked away with a deeper respect for questions than answers, while Danielle Brooks walked forward with the dream she had protected for more than 2 decades finally unfolding before her. And that day, everyone in the room remembered that wisdom does not belong to the youngest voice, the loudest opinion, or the most impressive title. It belongs to the person who never stopped learning, even when nobody was watching.